When the young Filipino kid stepped onto the AGT stage, he carried a presence far bigger than his small frame suggested. His name was Manila, a name that instantly caught the attention of the audience, not because it sounded unusual, but because he spoke it with this quiet pride that hinted at stories far beyond the stage lights. He stood there in a worn-out jacket that looked like it had passed through too many hands before finally landing on his shoulders, and his shoes had the kind of scuff marks that told the truth about a hard life. But even with those signs of struggle, something about him radiated hope. Behind him in the waiting area, cheering him on with restless energy, were his cousins Cebu, Davao, and Quezon, each named after the cities their families came from. They were all practically bouncing with excitement, whispering prayers, and nudging each other every time the cameras turned their way. The entire scene felt like a small piece of the Philippines had been airlifted right into the middle of America's most iconic talent stage. The second Manila touched the microphone, the atmosphere changed. It was subtle at first, a few heads tilting, a few eyebrows raised, but then he inhaled deeply, closed his eyes, and released a voice that didn't match his age, his size, or even the time period he lived in. The sound that came out was so rich, so velvety, and so uncannily Elvis-like that for a split second, the entire audience forgot where they were. It was as if someone had opened a door to the past and let the king of rock and roll step back through. The judges leaned forward almost in unison, and the crowd stilled so quickly you could practically hear the cameras rotating to capture the moment. Even the stage lights seemed to refocus themselves, as if they, too, realized this performance wasn't just another audition, it was something rare, something unexpected, something that shifted the energy of the room entirely. Manila didn't stay shy for long. The moment the music kicked in, he transformed right before everyone's eyes. His stance widened, his shoulders leveled, and suddenly the timid kid in a second-hand jacket carried himself like a polished performer from a Las Vegas residency. He moved with confidence, hips swaying just enough to nod to Elvis without copying him too much. His fingers curled around the microphone with a firm, steady grip, and his posture straightened as though he belonged on that stage more than anywhere else in the world. The contrast between the boy he was off stage and the performer he became under the spotlight was so dramatic that even people in the back rows sat forward to get a better look. And as his voice soared, deep in the lows, controlled in the highs, and dripping with that old-school Elvis charm, the energy in the theater swelled like a rising wave. It wasn't only his voice that captivated the room, it was the feeling behind it. Every note Manila sang carried the weight of his journey. You could hear the sold-out dreams, the nights spent practicing with a busted speaker, the mornings he woke up early to help his family before school, and the afternoons he'd sneak away to belt Elvis songs in open fields where nobody could hear him. The audience didn't just hear a kid performing, they felt the spirit of someone who had fought for this moment. And in that powerful blend of authenticity, talent, and heart, Manila didn't just sing Elvis. He revived him. He resurrected a sound people thought they'd never hear again with that level of purity and soul. By the time Manila hit the midpoint of his performance, the entire auditorium was locked in. No one moved, no one blinked, and no one dared make noise. The judges exchanged glances that silently said, "This is something different." And for the audience, it became instantly clear, this wasn't just another audition. This was a breakthrough. A moment they would remember long after the stage lights cooled. Manila had arrived, and he had brought the spirit of Elvis with him, alive, electric, and undeniable. While the entire audience was swept up in Manila's electrifying revival of Elvis, Simon Cowell was the one person on the judging panel who looked completely out of sync with the energy filling the theater. Unlike the others, who were leaning forward with widening smiles, Simon sat back stiffly, arms crossed, eyebrows pulled into a tight, skeptical line. It wasn't just mild doubt, it was a full-on disbelief that this small Filipino kid with a city's name could possibly deliver a sound so powerful. From the moment Manila opened his mouth, Simon's expression flickered between annoyance and confusion, as if he couldn't decide whether he was being impressed or being pranked. The more Manila leaned into those Elvis notes, the more Simon seemed thrown off, tapping his fingers impatiently against the judge's desk. But Manila remained unshaken, even though he could see Simon's cold, unimpressed reaction from the corner of his eye. In fact, the contrast only seemed to fuel him. The stage became his battlefield, and Simon's disbelief became the wall he had to break. Manila's voice deepened, strengthened, and surged with every lyric. His movements sharpened, echoing the confidence of performers who had spent entire lifetimes perfecting their craft. When he swayed his hips with that unmistakable Elvis rhythm, the audience erupted again, cheers rolling through the auditorium like a thunderstorm moving across the plains. Rows labeled Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Dallas jumped to their feet, waving their arms and shouting encouragement. The whole crowd felt like a living map of America, united by one kid's unstoppable fire. Simon, however, didn't budge. He tilted his head slightly, squinted, and gave this half-shrug that instantly read as disrespect. His reaction felt like a cold splash of water in a room filled with heat. It was the kind of expression that said, "I'm not convinced," even when everyone else clearly was. It made Manila's climb feel steeper, harder, and more heroic. But Manila wasn't there to make Simon comfortable, he was there to prove that a kid from the Philippines could stand shoulder to shoulder with the greatest voices. And so, he pushed his performance higher, throwing himself into the notes with fearless dedication. As Manila's confidence grew, so did the emotional weight of the moment. His cousins Cebu, Davao, and Quezon, watching from backstage, were practically vibrating with excitement. Every time Manila hit a difficult note, Cebu threw his hands up. When Manila nailed a signature Elvis vibrato, Davao punched the air, and when he slid into a smooth, low lyric, Quezon covered her mouth with shaking hands. They weren't just cheering for him, they were fighting with him, city-named warriors standing behind their champion. And while their pride rose, Simon's reaction remained icy. His eyes stayed locked on Manila, not with inspiration, but with irritation, as if he couldn't handle the idea of this kid outshining expectations. The audience noticed the tension. Whispers spread through the crowd, bouncing from Row Chicago to Row Phoenix, then to Row Miami, where fans said, "Simon doesn't get it. This kid is insane." And they were right. Manila's voice had grown into something extraordinary. The richness of his tone, the command in his delivery, the vintage American soul pouring out of a Filipino kid, it was the kind of performance that didn't just entertain, it made people feel something deep and unforgettable. And Simon, instead of celebrating it, seemed upset by it, like the performance was challenging his authority instead of inspiring his approval. By the time Manila hit the song's climax, the entire room was vibrating with adrenaline. The orchestra behind him swelled, the lights flashed with golden intensity, and every seat in the place, marked with cities from Seattle to Houston, seemed to lift off the ground. Manila poured everything he had into the final notes, releasing them with a passion so raw it sent chills through the crowd. Yet even then, Simon's reaction stayed stubbornly unimpressed, his expression locked in a cold stare that didn't match the thousands of voices cheering around him. But strangely, that poor reaction only made the moment more legendary. Manila wasn't just performing for applause, he was performing against doubt. And Simon's disbelief became the very obstacle that Manila's talent shattered. Right there, on one of the biggest stages in the world, a kid named Manila proved that talent doesn't need permission to shine. It simply rises. When Manila delivered the final note of his Elvis revival, the entire auditorium exploded into one of the loudest standing ovations AGT had heard all season. It wasn't just applause, it was a physical wave of sound, a tidal rush of cheers that rose from every corner of the room like a nationwide celebration. People jumped out of seats marked Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, and San Diego, all reacting as if they had just witnessed the rebirth of an icon. Signs waved in the air, camera flashes went wild, and security guards near the aisles exchanged looks because the audience nearly overflowed from excitement. Manila stood at the center of it all, breathing hard, chest rising and falling, but with eyes shining like someone who finally saw the future he'd only dared to imagine. But even in that roaring moment, Simon Cowell's reaction stood out like a cold shadow in a field of sunlight. While the other judges stood clapping, some smiling, some shouting praise, Simon remained seated, staring at Manila with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and irritation. It was almost as if he couldn't accept that this young Filipino kid, carrying the name of a major city, had just delivered one of the most unforgettable Elvis performances ever seen on the AGT stage. Simon tapped one finger on the desk, lips pressed tight, eyes narrowed, refusing to join the celebration happening all around him. His reaction didn't weaken the moment, it intensified it. Because every cheer, every scream, every emotional tear from the audience seemed to push back against Simon's coldness, proving that Manila's talent didn't need Simon's approval to be real. Backstage, Manila's cousins, Cebu, Davao, and Quezon, were crying openly. Cebu wiped his face with the sleeve of his worn hoodie, unable to contain the pride swelling in his chest. Davao, usually quiet and reserved, let out a loud shout that startled half the crew members standing nearby. And Quezon covered her entire face with both hands, shaking with joy, her emotions overflowing after years of watching Manila fight through challenges far away from the spotlight. To them, this wasn't just a performance. It was a victory, for their family, for their community, and for every kid who had ever felt small but dreamed big. Watching Manila stand on that stage, bathed in golden lights and overwhelmed by cheers, felt like watching a city rise. The audience continued chanting his name, a rhythmic roar that rolled across the theater like the heartbeat of multiple cities merging into one, Manila. 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 It was powerful, overwhelming, and emotional. Even the cameramen struggled to keep their shots steady because the energy filling the room felt almost physical. People in the balcony sections labeled Boston, Baltimore, and Cleveland leaned so far forward that ushers had to remind them to step back for safety. This wasn't just appreciation, it was adoration. And through all of it, Manila stood tall, holding the microphone with trembling hands but a steady gaze. He looked out over the crowd, blinking hard, trying to hold back tears because he knew what this moment meant. He knew how many obstacles he had pushed through, how many nights he had stayed awake practicing, how many times he'd been told he wasn't big enough, strong enough, or American enough to chase a dream this massive. But right here, under the brightest lights of his life, thousands of strangers from cities across the USA were proving those doubts wrong. Meanwhile, Simon's stiff, unimpressed posture became the very contrast that made Manila shine brighter. The more Simon resisted, the more the audience rallied behind the boy. It felt symbolic, hope against doubt, heart against coldness, talent against ego. And Manila, with his city-born name and soul-deep voice, stood as the champion of that clash. By the time the cheers finally began to settle, Manila knew something life-changing had happened. He had not only revived Elvis, he had revived the belief that greatness can come from anywhere. From any family. From any city name. From any kid who refuses to give up. And in that legendary moment, Manila didn't just impress America, he shocked Simon Cowell to his core.